At exactly 8:42 a.m., Imani Harper eased her car into a modest parking spot along a busy city street just a short walk from the local courthouse. The early light danced off her windshield as she sank into the driver's seat for a brief pause. Dressed neatly in a fitted navy jacket, her dark, tightly curled hair falling gently over her brow, and with her worn leather briefcase clutched in hand, she tried to steady her jittery nerves. Today, the stakes were personal. This wasn't the high-pressure federal courtroom where she usually prosecuted tough cases. It was a municipal hearing, and at its heart lay the modest home her late mother had cherished. That house, tucked away in an old neighborhood, wasn't merely bricks and mortar. It was the heart of her family story, a living lesson in strength and honor that her mother, both a teacher and a community advocate, had lovingly passed down. A short walk later, the courthouse loomed before her like an ancient sentinel. Its time-worn bricks and the gentle hum of early chatter mingled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and old paper, filling the entrance hall with an almost tangible history. As Imani passed through security, she couldn't help but notice the busy crowd clutching folders and whispering anxious words. Every clack of her heels against the tiled floor echoed like a steady drumbeat, marking her determined stride toward a battle that felt much larger than one overdue court appearance. Could one day of delays really overshadow decades of personal sacrifice? The question hung in the air as she made her way toward the designated courtroom. Inside, the space buzzed with a mix of hushed murmurs and the shuffling of papers. Imani chose a seat toward the rear, her eyes scanning the worn wooden benches where many had come seeking justice in their own quiet ways. The plaque above the bench read "The Honorable Judge Latham," and moments later, a tall man with silver hair and an expression as hard as stone swept into the room. His gaze, cold and measured, seemed to inspect every soul as if he were counting mistakes. A few individuals, one older gentleman and a couple of young faces, had already taken their seats, their presence as fleeting as a soft sigh in the charged silence. At exactly 9 a.m., the bailiff's call snapped the room to order. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Latham," he announced. The judge's entrance was as commanding as a stage cue, his presence silencing the room further. Imani's carefully arranged folder rested on her lap as she waited, heart pounding in tandem with her footsteps. In that moment, the courtroom felt less like a hall of justice and more like a battlefield where every minute could tip the scales of fate. The proceedings began briskly, with cases called one after another. A couple of latecomers, a middle-aged man in a wrinkled suit and a young woman in a hoodie, appeared without drawing much comment from Judge Latham. Then came the moment that would etch itself into Imani's memory. The clerk's voice echoed through the room as he announced, "Harper versus the city." Rising slowly, Imani smoothed her blazer and approached the podium, her folder open and documents in perfect order. As soon as she began, Judge Latham's tone turned icy. "Miss Harper, you are here regarding your property case, yet you arrive late," he said sharply. A heavy silence fell. Imani's mind raced. Just moments earlier, she had been called away to address an urgent federal motion in a corruption case. But here, in this municipal chamber, her delay was being counted against her. "Your Honor, I apologize. I had urgent matters to attend to," she explained, voice calm yet edged with quiet determination. But before she could continue, Judge Latham's words cut in like a snapped twig. "Excuses do not excuse tardiness. This court demands respect and punctuality. You are fined $750 for contempt." His tone was clipped and final, and a ripple of discontent stirred among those watching. In that instant, Imani's grip tightened on her folder. She fought to keep her emotions from betraying her, even as a cold realization crept over her. This wasn't merely about a lost minute, it was about a system that seemed to penalize her more harshly than others. Her eyes briefly met those of an older black gentleman sitting a few rows ahead, a silent nod passed between them, as if to say, "I see you." With that unspoken understanding, Imani felt the weight of history and injustice pressing down on her shoulders. After the ruling, the courtroom continued as if nothing had happened, but Imani's mind buzzed with a new clarity. She began scribbling notes on the margins of her legal pad, determined to capture every detail, the judge's stern tone, his swift dismissal of her explanation, and the uneven treatment that seemed all too familiar. Every tap of her pen was a vow that she would not let this moment slip into silence without challenge. As the session moved on, she barely registered the paperwork on her desk. Her focus had shifted to something far more significant than property taxes. It was about fairness and the dignity of every person who walked these halls. Outside, as the courthouse doors swung open into a brisk autumn day, the cool air carried a whisper of change. Imani paused on the steps, pulling out her phone. A message from her assistant had arrived earlier, reiterating that Judge Latham had a well-known reputation for being especially strict with black defendants. The message's words stung with a truth she had known all too well. The fine was not just a penalty for tardiness, it was a signal of a deeper, more pervasive bias. With the wind tugging playfully at the hem of her blazer, she made a decision. This was not the end of her fight, it was only the beginning of a much larger quest for justice. Later that same day, in the quiet solitude of her modest kitchen, Imani sat at the table, her folder of tax documents pushed aside as she reviewed a thick stack of case files. The documents detailed similar patterns of harsh fines and quick dismissals, not just in her own case but in many others that echoed the same tone of bias. Her thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of her phone. It was a call from Karen Blake, a retired judge and one of the very first women of color to serve on a high appellate court. Karen's voice was steady and full of understanding as she asked, "Are you all right?" Imani ran a hand through her hair inside. "I'm fine, but what happened today, it wasn't right. I can't just let it go." There was a pause on the other end before Karen continued, "You're not wrong, Imani. I've seen this bias in courtrooms before. The real question now is, what will you do about it?" The weight of Karen's words settled over her like a soft blanket, and though the answer wasn't immediately clear, Imani knew one thing: she would not stand by in silence. Determined to gather evidence and build a case against this injustice, Imani reached out to Eric Daniels, a well-respected civil rights lawyer known for his long fight against systemic wrongs. In a quiet office that smelled faintly of coffee and old books, she recounted the events of the morning in detail. "Eric," she said firmly, "there's something off in that courtroom. It's not just about being late, it's about a system that seems to target us. I need your help." Eric listened intently, nodding as he jotted down notes. "Bias like this isn't new," he replied, "but it must be challenged. We need clear evidence, records of his rulings, and testimonies from those who've suffered under these unfair rules." Over the following days, Imani balanced her busy schedule of federal cases while diving deep into the murky history of Judge Latham's courtroom. She scoured public records, piecing together a troubling pattern. Black defendants were consistently met with fines and penalties far harsher than those handed to their white counterparts. Her calls to fellow attorneys yielded a mix of confirmations and hesitations. Many had seen the same bias but were wary of the fallout if they spoke out. One conversation, in particular, with a longtime court clerk named Rachel Thompson, proved pivotal. Initially quiet and guarded, Rachel eventually confided, "I've noticed it, too. The judge tends to be much tougher on black defendants, fines, harsher sentences, even the tone he uses. I've been writing things down in a little notebook. I'll share it with you, but I need to stay anonymous." Her whispered words were a spark in a growing fire of injustice. In a matter of weeks, Imani and Eric compiled a detailed report that laid bare the uneven treatment in that courtroom. Their findings were staggering. Over the past 5 years, statistics showed that black defendants were 3 times more likely to receive the highest fines for minor infractions than white ones. It wasn't just about numbers, though. There were real stories behind the data. One case belonged to David Carter, a young man who had been slapped with a $1,000 fine for a parking ticket, even after he presented clear evidence that the ticket was wrongly issued. "I felt as if his mind was made up the moment I walked in," David recalled in a trembling voice. Then there was Angela Mitchell, a single mother who faced an exorbitant fine for contesting a zoning decision, while a white person in a similar situation was given nothing more than a warning. Each story, each detail, added layers to the undeniable picture of bias. When their report was finally submitted to the Judicial Review Board, a body meant to root out such misconduct, the ripple effect was immediate. A law student who had been present during the hearing posted an account on social media, and within hours, the story had gone viral. People from across the community began sharing similar tales of unfair treatment in the courtroom. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon headlines like "Bias in the Courtroom, Judge Under Fire" dominated the airwaves. Outside the courthouse, groups gathered with handmade signs calling for justice for all and "End Bias Now." The collective outcry grew louder by the day, and it wasn't long before the pressure became too heavy for the judge to bear. In the midst of the storm, Imani kept her focus. Even as she continued her federal cases, she worked closely with the review board, determined to see the investigation through. Every small detail, like the careful notes in Rachel Thompson's notebook, became a crucial piece of the puzzle. Within 2 weeks, the mounting evidence forced the issue into the open. Judge Latham, facing increasing scrutiny from both the public and his peers, finally issued a statement. In carefully measured words, he denied any wrongdoing, yet behind closed doors he found himself summoned repeatedly to meetings with oversight committees. The community's call for accountability grew louder, and the idea that one judge's bias could undermine an entire system could no longer be ignored. Then, on a day when the autumn air seemed to shimmer with anticipation, Judge Latham announced his resignation. His farewell statement expressed regret for any actions that might have been seen as unfair but stopped short of admitting guilt. Outside the courthouse, as news spread like wildfire, jubilant supporters gathered, their cheers echoing against the stone walls. They held signs and chanted, feeling that this was the first tangible step toward rebalancing a long-warped system. Yet, as Imani walked past the celebrating crowd with quiet determination, she knew deep down that one resignation would not erase years of injustice. The real challenge lay in uprooting the structures that allowed such bias to flourish unchecked. In the weeks that followed, the local authorities moved quickly to appoint a new judge, someone known for fairness and an even-handed approach. Judge Reed, as she came to be known, wasted no time in implementing changes that resonated with a community hungry for justice. Under her guidance, defendants who struggled with hefty fines were offered flexible payment plans, language interpreters became a common feature in courtrooms, and clear, multilingual signs replaced the old, confusing notices on every wall. Even the courthouse itself seemed reborn, its dull beige walls now carried brighter hues, and every detail was designed to welcome rather than intimidate. For the first time in a long while, the atmosphere in that sacred hall of law felt hopeful. Imani attended one of Judge Reed's early sessions as an observer, where she watched a young man argue his case over a minor zoning issue. Unlike the previous rigid environment, Judge Reed listened intently, allowing the man to finish his story without interruption. Her measured responses and genuine respect for every voice in the room ignited a small but powerful spark in Imani's heart. Could it be that justice might finally be delivered without prejudice? As the young man's relief was palpable in the room, Imani felt that glimmer of hope grow brighter, even as questions about the past still lingered in the air. Her journey had transformed from defending her mother's home to challenging a deep-seated system of unfairness. Imani soon found herself in the center of a growing movement that reached far beyond the courthouse steps. Invitations to speak at local forums, law schools, and community gatherings began to flood in. In each new engagement, she shared the hard-won lessons of that day, the fine, the cold dismissal, and the evidence of a biased system. One afternoon, after a particularly moving session, a young black attorney approached her with a notebook bursting with ideas. "You've shown me that change is real," he said softly. "For years, I felt like my voice didn't count, but your courage has given me the strength to speak up." Imani's smile was gentle as she replied, "Change starts when we dare to stand up, even when it feels impossible." And with that, another seed of hope was planted. Her seminars soon turned into powerful calls to action. Imani urged her audiences not only to recognize bias but also to fight it with clear steps, collect data on court decisions, demand regular reviews of judicial actions, and support independent oversight of the legal process. Her message resonated with seasoned lawyers, young advocates, and community members alike, all of whom began to see that a few brave voices could spark a nationwide conversation about fairness. It was a stirring reminder that even in the face of stubborn injustice, every person's word could help build a better system. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the detailed report compiled by Imani and Eric Daniels began to work its magic. Rachel Thompson's careful notes, along with testimonies from people like David Carter and Angela Mitchell, painted an undeniable picture. Over time, black defendants in Judge Latham's courtroom had been hit with fines and penalties that were alarmingly out of line with those imposed on others. The numbers told a story of injustice, a story that no one could ignore. When the Judicial Review Board read the findings aloud during a tense hearing, Imani sat among a crowd of supporters, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The words spilled out like a final verdict on years of hidden bias, leaving the room in a heavy, expectant silence. What would be the next move in this high-stakes game of justice? The public reaction was swift and fierce. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, waving signs with bold slogans such as "Equal Justice Now" and "End Bias Immediately." Social media erupted with personal accounts of similar mistreatment, and local news outlets soon ran headlines declaring, "Systemic bias exposed, judge resigns amid scandal." The energy was electric, a mix of relief and righteous anger that filled the streets. Though the judge's resignation was a victory, Imani knew that the scars of injustice would not vanish overnight. The resignation was a signal, a call to dismantle the very systems that allowed such bias to flourish in the first place. In the days that followed, as the local community buzzed with renewed determination, Imani continued her work with the same quiet resolve that had carried her through the courthouse that fateful morning. She partnered with civil rights lawyers, community activists, and even former court employees to draft a list of reforms. Their proposals were clear: all judges should undergo regular bias training, court rulings must be audited routinely, and an independent oversight committee should be established to handle complaints of misconduct. Every suggestion, every measure was aimed at restoring trust in a system that had long been marred by inequality. As she pored over the draft proposals one evening, the weight of her responsibility was both heavy and hopeful. Could these changes really set a new course for justice? Months later, on a crisp morning that reminded her of the day it all began, Imani stood on the courthouse steps once again. This time, however, the atmosphere was charged with a sense of renewal rather than resignation. A new chapter had begun with the appointment of Judge Reed, whose fair-minded approach had already started to turn the tide. In one of her first sessions, Judge Reed had listened with genuine care as a young man contested a minor zoning ruling, an experience so different from the hostile encounters of the past that it felt almost surreal. As Imani watched the proceedings, she couldn't help but wonder, could this truly be the start of a more equal justice system? That day, a new Judicial Ethics Center was inaugurated, a place dedicated to addressing systemic bias and ensuring that every courtroom visitor was treated with respect. Invited to deliver the opening address, Imani stepped to the podium amid a gathering of judges, lawyers, clerks, and community members. Her voice, steady and clear, filled the room as she declared, "Justice isn't only about laws and rulings, it's about people, about ensuring that every person who comes before us is treated with the dignity they deserve." The applause that followed was thunderous, yet behind the clapping hands lay the knowledge that the work was far from over. After the ceremony, a curious law student lingered by the steps, asking softly, "How do we keep this change alive?" Imani paused, her eyes reflecting the hope and resolve of many who had suffered in silence. "By listening to those who are hurt the most," she answered. "And by never forgetting that every voice, no matter how small, has the power to change the world." Her words rippled through the crowd like a gentle wave, leaving everyone with a question: what would you do when faced with injustice? In the weeks and months that followed, Imani's story grew into a national conversation about fairness in the legal system. Communities in other cities began to review their own court practices, and new oversight programs were launched. Data soon showed a marked decrease in racial disparities in fines and sentencing, a sign that the seeds of change had taken root. For Imani, the true reward came in quiet moments, receiving heartfelt letters from people whose lives had been touched by her courage, or watching a once skeptical colleague embrace the fight for equality. The journey had been long and hard, but every step had led to a greater hope. What started as a personal battle to defend a family home had grown into a full-blown movement for justice. With each story shared, each record uncovered, and every small victory celebrated, the old, biased system began to crumble, replaced by a structure that promised fairness and respect for all. As the sun set on another day of hard-fought progress, Imani Harper walked away from the courthouse with her head held high. In her heart, the promise of true justice, one that was built on the courage to challenge wrongs, burned brighter than ever. And as the cool evening breeze whispered through the city streets, one question lingered in the air: if one person can spark a movement, what could each of us do when we dare to stand up for what is right?